you live for the days when the band is together, because there's nothing can quite equal.
Mark Knopfler, the legendary frontman of Dire Straits, has long been admired for his unique guitar sound, poetic songwriting, and cool, understated presence on stage. For decades, his music, especially timeless hits like Sultans of Swing and Brothers in Arms, has resonated with fans across the globe. Unlike many rock stars who thrived on scandal and public feuds, Knopfler always seemed to remain above the noise, letting his music speak for itself. But as much as he stayed away from drama, Knopfler, like all artists, had strong opinions about the music industry. Behind his calm exterior, there were bands and movements he simply couldn't stand. Whether it was because of clashing styles, inflated egos, or the direction music was taking in certain decades, Knopfler was never afraid, at least in private, to express his disdain. Now at 76, fans are shocked to hear Knopfler finally open up about the 6 bands he truly couldn't tolerate. These aren't just casual dislikes. They're groups that represented everything he felt was wrong with music during his era. The revelations paint a different picture of Knopfler, not just the thoughtful songwriter, but a man with sharp convictions about what music should and shouldn't be. Today, we're pulling back the curtain to reveal which 6 bands Mark Knopfler despised the most. Why he felt the Mark Knopfler's rise to fame wasn't the story of a traditional rock star. Born in Glasgow and raised in Newcastle, Knopfler didn't fit the mold of the wild, leather-clad guitar hero who dominated the 1970s and 80s. Instead, he built his career on restraint, sophistication, and precision. When Dire Straits released Sultans of Swing in 1978, audiences were struck by something different. A guitarist who didn't need distortion, theatrics, or flashy solos to impress. Knopfler's finger-picking style, clean tone, and storytelling lyrics set him apart immediately. By the early 1980s, Dire Straits had become one of the biggest bands in the world. Their landmark album, Brothers in Arms, sold over 30 million copies, cementing Knopfler's reputation as a craftsman of timeless songs. Unlike many of his peers, he avoided the excesses of drugs, scandals, and egotistical feuds that defined the rock scene. For years, fans assumed Knopfler had little interest in criticizing others, preferring to quietly focus on his own work. But those who knew him well understood that he carried very strong opinions about music and the industry around him. Knopfler often expressed a quiet frustration with what he saw as the superficial side of rock and roll. While he admired musicians who valued authenticity, he had little patience for bands that relied on gimmicks, image, or hype rather than talent and substance. In interviews, he hinted at his distaste for the explosion of glam rock in the 70s, where elaborate costumes and makeup overshadowed the actual music. He also made it clear that he wasn't impressed by groups who, in his eyes, prioritized commercial appeal over artistry. What made Knopfler different was that his criticism wasn't about jealousy or rivalry, it was about principle. To him, music was storytelling, honesty, and craftsmanship. When he encountered bands who dismissed those values, he quietly took note. Even if he didn't always speak publicly about his dislikes, the feelings were there, simmering beneath the surface. This perspective is what makes his eventual revelation so fascinating. Knopfler didn't hate lightly. His disapproval came from a place of deep conviction. At 76, when he finally named the 6 bands he could never stand, it wasn't just gossip. It was a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who usually let his guitar do the talking. His words shed light on the deeper musical philosophies that shaped Dire Straits and his later solo work. Before we get to those names, it's important to understand the context of Knopfler's worldview. The late 1970s and 1980s were a chaotic time in music. Punk was tearing down the rules of rock, glam was dazzling audiences with excess, and pop was becoming increasingly driven by image. In the middle of all this, Knopfler carved out a space that felt timeless, rooted in blues, folk, and storytelling traditions. He saw himself as part of a lineage of musicians who valued honesty over flash, subtlety over spectacle. And when he looked at certain bands rising alongside him, he saw something very different, something he rejected outright. For Knopfler, disliking these bands wasn't just about taste. It was about what they represented in an industry he often viewed with suspicion. And that's why, when he finally revealed them decades later, the list shocked fans because it proved that even one of rock's most reserved figures carried a quiet fire of disdain for the direction music sometimes took, to weigh, and how his opinions shaped his own approach to music. When Mark Knopfler finally began to open up about the bands he couldn't stand, fans were both surprised and fascinated. For decades, Knopfler had built his reputation on being measured, thoughtful, and calm, someone who never seemed caught up in the drama of rock rivalries. But behind his quiet exterior, there were groups he genuinely disliked, not just for their sound, but for what they represented in the broader music industry. The first target of his disdain was the world of glam rock, and one of the most famous bands associated with that era was Kiss. While Knopfler respected their success and ability to create a spectacle, he reportedly viewed them as a symbol of style over substance. To him, the makeup, pyrotechnics, and theatrics overshadowed the actual music. Knopfler, who valued stripped-down authenticity, couldn't relate to the idea of turning rock and roll into a circus act. In his view, Kiss was entertainment, not artistry, and that distinction mattered deeply to him. Another group that fell into Knopfler's crosshairs was Van Halen. Though Eddie Van Halen was universally admired for his groundbreaking guitar skills, Knopfler found the band's emphasis on flashy solos and high-energy bravado to be the exact opposite of his own approach. Knopfler didn't need to tap, shred, or play at lightning speed to move an audience. His music thrived on subtlety. To him, Van Halen represented a kind of excess that reduced guitar playing to a spectacle, rather than a form of storytelling. Moving into the punk era, Knopfler also had little patience for bands like the Sex Pistols. While punk was celebrated for tearing down the establishment and bringing raw energy back to music, Knopfler saw much of it as sloppy, careless, and intentionally provocative without much depth. To him, music wasn't about shock value. It was about craft. The Pistols may have made history, but Knopfler reportedly felt they lacked the musicianship and sincerity that he held dear. And then there was Bon Jovi. As the 1980s progressed, the rise of big-hair stadium rock was something Knopfler found grating. Bon Jovi's brand of radio-friendly anthems, full of glossy production and arena sing-alongs, was the polar opposite of the grounded, roots-inspired sound Knopfler preferred. He saw bands like Bon Jovi as symbols of music being reduced to a formula, a way to sell records rather than to tell stories. For someone like Knopfler, who carefully crafted lyrics and arrangements, this felt like a betrayal of what rock music should stand for. Each of these dislikes reveals something important about Knopfler's musical philosophy. He wasn't just singling out bands for the sake of criticism. He was highlighting his frustration with larger movements in the industry. Glam rock, shredding guitar theatrics, punk shock value, and corporate stadium rock each clashed with his belief that music should be rooted in authenticity, emotion, and storytelling. By naming these bands, Knopfler wasn't trying to stir controversy. Instead, he was underlining the values that guided his own career. He may not have screamed his opinions from the rooftops, but privately, and eventually, later in life, he admitted there were groups he simply couldn't stand to listen to. And this was only half of the list. At 76, Knopfler surprised fans by naming 6 bands he truly disliked. We've heard about some of them already, but there were still more names to come, each with its own story about why they earned his quiet disdain. If the first few bands on Mark Knopfler's list revealed his dislike for glam spectacle, punk chaos, and glossy stadium rock, the remaining names dug even deeper into what truly frustrated him about the changing music scene. By the late 1970s and into the 80s, the industry was shifting rapidly, and Knopfler often felt like an outsider holding on to values that were slipping away. One band that often drew his quiet disdain was Poison, the poster child for hair metal excess. To Knopfler, bands like Poison embodied everything he disliked about the way rock music was heading. Big hair, flashy clothes, shallow lyrics, and music videos that looked more like fashion commercials than serious artistic expression. While millions of fans embraced the era of glam metal, Knopfler dismissed it as hollow entertainment, driven more by MTV visuals than by musicianship. Poison, in his view, was a marketing machine, not a band with lasting substance. Another band that Knopfler reportedly couldn't tolerate was Journey. While Journey had undeniable success with soaring ballads like Don't Stop Believin', Knopfler found their brand of slick, radio-friendly rock formulaic. To him, the music was too polished, too predictable, and too focused on mass appeal. Journey represented a kind of corporate rock that didn't align with his roots-oriented approach. For Knopfler, storytelling should feel lived-in and real, not designed for stadium sing-alongs and guaranteed record sales. Perhaps the most surprising addition to his list was Guns N' Roses. On the surface, they had raw energy and undeniable musicianship, which might seem closer to Knopfler's values. But Knopfler reportedly disliked the band's obsession with chaos, controversy, and self-destruction. While he respected Slash as a guitarist, he couldn't embrace the band's overall image of reckless rebellion. To Knopfler, their notoriety sometimes overshadowed their craft, and that imbalance left him unimpressed. By naming bands like Poison, Journey, and Guns N' Roses alongside groups such as Kiss, Bon Jovi, Van Halen, and the Sex Pistols, Knopfler painted a picture of the industry that frustrated him. It wasn't that he hated success or popularity. Dire Straits sold millions of records, after all, but rather that he hated what he saw as the sacrifice of sincerity for spectacle. These 6 bands, in Knopfler's mind, were not just rivals in style. They symbolized larger trends that stood in direct opposition to his musical philosophy. He believed music should be intimate, personal, and timeless. He valued songs that could be stripped down to just a guitar and a voice, still carrying the same emotional weight. Bands that relied on theatrics, polished formulas, or controversy simply didn't fit into that vision. It's important to note, though, that Knopfler's criticisms were never cruel or personal. He didn't attack these bands publicly during the height of their careers, nor did he seek to humiliate their fans. His distaste was more of a quiet conviction, an internal judgment that shaped the way he approached his own work. In fact, by avoiding the styles he disliked, Knopfler doubled down on his own artistry, ensuring that Dire Straits and his solo career would stand apart from the crowd. At 76, when he finally admitted the bands he truly couldn't stand, it wasn't about bitterness, it was about honesty. After decades of staying silent, he allowed himself to reveal what he really thought, giving fans a rare glimpse into his private opinions. And for many, it only deepened their respect for him, proving that even the calmest, most reserved artists carry strong convictions about the art they love and the art they don't. When Mark Knopfler finally admitted the 6 bands he truly disliked, it wasn't a moment of bitterness, but rather one of reflection. At 76, he no longer had to protect reputations or worry about stepping on industry toes. His career had already spoken for itself. Multi-platinum records, sold-out tours, and a body of work that had inspired generations of musicians. Revealing the bands he hated was less about grudges and more about defining his philosophy of music. For Knopfler, music was always about authenticity. Growing up in Newcastle, he was shaped by folk, blues, and the working-class storytelling traditions of Britain. His guitar style, a blend of finger-picking and subtle phrasing, was unique, and it became his signature. Unlike many of the bands he criticized, Knopfler never leaned on heavy theatrics or image-driven marketing. He believed music should speak for itself, with no distractions. This perspective explains why his list of hated bands made sense. Groups like Kiss or Poison relied heavily on stage makeup, costumes, and pyrotechnics. To Knopfler, that was a betrayal of what rock music could be. Similarly, bands like Bon Jovi and Journey perfected a polished, radio-friendly sound that felt too calculated, lacking the raw honesty he valued. Even the Sex Pistols and Guns N' Roses, though wildly different in style, represented chaos and spectacle that overshadowed the craft. By naming these bands, Knopfler wasn't trying to tear them down. In fact, he often acknowledged that they had talent and that millions of fans genuinely loved their work. His criticism was more about direction, the way the music industry rewarded flash over substance, controversy over craft, and image over musicianship. Knopfler wanted his legacy to be the opposite. Timeless songs that stood on their own without gimmicks. In truth, Knopfler's dislikes revealed just as much about his strengths as they do about his frustrations. His refusal to follow trends gave us songs like Sultans of Swing, Brothers in Arms, and Romeo and Juliet, tracks that remain staples decades later. While many of the bands he disliked saw their popularity fade as styles shifted, Knopfler's music has endured because it was built on something deeper. There's also an important lesson in his honesty. For years, he kept his criticisms to himself, choosing not to start public feuds. Only later in life did he feel comfortable enough to say what he really thought. That restraint reflected his professionalism and his respect for music as a whole. He knew there was no need to insult peers during their prime. Instead, he let time and history decide whose work would last. Now, as fans look back on his career, his candid admissions provide context. They show that even a calm, measured artist like Knopfler held strong opinions about his craft. They also highlight the fact that success doesn't mean universal admiration. Every musician has their heroes and their frustrations, and Knopfler was no exception. At 76, when he finally named the 6 bands he hated most, it wasn't about negativity, it was about clarity. It was about drawing a line between the kind of music he believed in and the kind he rejected. And in doing so, he reminded fans that staying true to your principles matters more than chasing trends. Knopfler's story proves that while fame fades and genres change, authenticity endures. He may have disliked certain bands, but his music continues to resonate, quietly, sincerely, and powerfully. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all.